Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook. This podcast was sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. In a previous episode, we covered the environmental history of the Western Front during World War I. Today, we turn our attention to the maritime environmental history of the North Sea. The North Sea was one of the most relevant naval theaters of the war. It was also home to important fishing grounds. By 1914, a combination of technology, markets, and demand was likely leading to overfishing in the region. The war would reverse this, but was it a long-term respite, or what was the short and long-term impact of World War I on the North Sea? To discuss these questions, we are joined by Dr. Ingo Heidbrink, professor of history at Old Dominion University, who specializes in maritime history. Welcome, sir, and thank you for joining us today.
Welcome.
So, to start us off with, can you describe the North Sea geographically and ecologically? What areas are we talking about, and what is there?
Of course, and if we are talking about the North Sea, that means we are talking about a shallow adjacent sea to the North Atlantic, located between the British Isles, between Denmark and the German Bight in the southeast. That means basically a sea that is central to Northern Europe, and that's at the same time between the belligerent nations of World War One. When it comes to nature, as already mentioned, it is an extreme shallow area, and at the same time, there is a lot of fish in it. You might say it is one of the most interesting areas for global fisheries due to the high concentration of fish. And in terms of economy, and while there was fisheries in the North Sea for centuries, since the late 19th century, more particularly since the 1890s, this industry boomed due to the combination of steam and railroad for distribution to the market. So the fish, mainly herring and cod and species like plaice, and they were heavily fished in the time before 1900 and in the years before 1900 due to high demand by the growing cities of the continent and also high demand for cheap protein. And so basically you might say it was an area close to the major ports of the belligerent nations that supplied their industrial workforce with cheap protein.
I've heard it described before, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but as the kind of Mediterranean of Northern Europe, in a sense. Does that make sense?
In a certain sense, it makes a lot of sense, because if you are going back even to medieval times and you are talking about the Hanseatic League, and so you are seeing this dense trade network between the nations surrounding the North Sea. But there's one major difference between the Mediterranean and the North Sea that's relevant for this one. In the Mediterranean, from the point of view, from the perspective of fisheries, you have a lot of very beautiful, small, colorful fish that are not appearing in very dense schools. And while in the North Sea, you have fewer species, but these species are occurring in much denser schools. And so therefore, for the fishermen, the North Sea is much more attractive because you have these big schools of fish, single species, often more or less even same age cohort. And that means if you're fishing there, you're not getting this mix of whatever number of species, but you are getting one species, more or less same size, and therefore ideal for, let's say, industrialized fisheries and industrialized processing of fish. So there are similarities, but especially when it comes to fisheries, it's very different.
Interesting. One last little bit of orientation for our listeners. We're going to be talking about trawlers. Explain to us what a trawler is.
Trawler, in this understanding, we are talking about steam trawlers, is basically a fishing vessel that is using a trawl. That means an active fishing gear that's pulled through the water. traditional net. Think about a shopping bag you are basically pulling through the water. And so therefore they are highly efficient fishing vessels. More important, they became a reality only in the 1890s, and that means when the shipbuilding technology, engine technology allowed to build efficient steamships, and at the same time when the fishing technology, net design, allowed for constructing these huge nets, these big carpets that allow to utilize the fish stocks as good as possible. So we are talking about vessels of, let's say, 30 meters means little shorter than 100 foot and with normally 14 to 15 crew. And the other thing that's really important is they were designed to bring the fish ashore on ice. That means they were bringing dead fish that was gutted and stored on ice, not frozen. So therefore, they were designed for a sea duration of approximately 14 days, 3 weeks maybe, and they were extremely seaworthy, these vessels. So we are talking about medium-sized vessels that were operated by a comparable small number of crew with an extreme high seaworthiness. And this was, of course, what made them also attractive to the navies later on.
Now, you mentioned that right around 1900, there is clearly some overfishing happening. So let's fast forward just a little bit to 1914. The war hasn't started just yet, but is it still the same thing happening, overfishing? What's happening in the North Sea?
In 1914, it is still overfishing going on. It is substantially overfishing going on. But of course, if we are talking about overfishing, we need to understand that overfishing is a relative term. So we are not talking about extinction of a particular species. We are talking about overfishing in relation to the fishing technology available at that time. That means if we are talking about a fishing boat of that time, sailing out and spending the same effort on fishing and returning with a lower catch. That means we are talking about relative overfishing. We are talking about number of trawlers, too many trawlers operating, not being capable of extincting a species, but losing catch in relation to effort. And this overfishing was happening all over the North Sea. Main reason for it, of course, the demand. If we are talking about industrial fisheries or industrialized fisheries, we are talking about a supply and demand relation. And demand for cheap protein in particular was increasing also in the years prior to the war. We are seeing the increase in population all over Europe. We are also seeing the growth of the big cities, of the industrialized centers. And so therefore, fishing was attractive wherever we were looking around at the North Sea, provided an opportunity for the companies to make good money. And they were building trawlers in all of these nations, in particular Germany and the UK. And all of these trawlers set sail and they managed to have a successful fishery. Despite of catch per unit effort, to use the scientific term, going down, all of them sent out all of the ships available to them. So we are seeing a growing fleet and at the same time, in total, growing catch despite of overfishing going on and therefore catch per unit effort going down already.
Can you outline the naval war in the North Sea and how does this impact fishing?
If we are talking about the naval war in the North Sea, and I need to admit that I'm fisheries historian, not naval historian. So from my perspective, there are, first of all, is if you are thinking about the North Sea from all World War One and the outbreak, you need to understand that basically all nations preparing or participating in the weapons race, in the naval race, naval arms race before World War One were also thinking about the fisheries as a potential pool for crewing naval vessels. So therefore, they were considering the fisheries as training base, you might say, for their naval fleets. That means when the war broke out, one thing happened. All these fishermen were recruited basically to the navies. So therefore, fishing went down. Same happened with their boats, and they were recruited as auxiliary warships. But when it comes to the main fleet, what is it we are seeing? We are seeing the North Sea is the predicted battleground, theater of war, main theater of war for World War One. But after the Battle of Jutland, and we are seeing basically not much is happening in the North Sea theater. We are seeing the standoff, and then both sides are retreating into their ports, and the North Sea is basically not seeing much activity, but also not seeing much fishery. We are, of course, seeing mine laying activities. We are seeing the Northern Mine Barrage, where the US later on becomes involved, and we are seeing all this activity. But on the other hand, it's a pretty stable situation, typical stalemate situation. Both sides are observing each other. There are certain actions by comparable small units, and the big units are simply waiting what's happening, and that's a situation, yeah, really characteristic for World War One and the North Sea.
Now, in your work on this topic, you acknowledged that the generally accepted thesis for many years was that the lack of fishing during World War One led then to an increase in fish and even an increase in the average size of a fish. You argue, though, that we can't just look at the period 1914 to 1918 or even 1919. So, what environmental story does the post war period tell?
If you're looking at the wartime itself, of course, if there's no fishing, that's beneficial for the fish stock, and so therefore the size of the fish stock is increasing, and even the size of the fish is increasing, and there's simply more time to grow for the fish. In particular, if we are talking about species like herring, because the reproduction cycle of herring is comparably short, if we are talking about species like cod or the various flatfish, story is a little different as the reproduction cycle is longer, and so therefore the effects are a little more delayed, and 4 years do not have too much of an effect. But when it comes to herrings, a central species for the North Sea fisheries, then 4 years is substantial, and therefore we are seeing during wartime itself this highly beneficial effect on the fish stock. If we are looking at the time after the war, we are seeing substantial food shortages in basically a number of nations around the North Sea and a number of the former belligerent nations. And more important, despite of the war resulting in a substantial loss of trawlers because they've been used as auxiliary warships whatsoever, at the same time, the navies all around build new trawler-type vessels as auxiliary warships. These auxiliary warships now, after the end of the war, are becoming converted into trawlers. And if you are thinking about these trawlers, in comparison to the pre-war models, they are much more sophisticated, they are much larger vessels, and or not much larger, but are larger vessels with higher fishing capacity. So in the end, at the beginning of the war and during the war, we had a fleet of very old trawlers or mixed age fleet of trawlers. And now we are seeing basically the navies supplying their respective fisheries with the most sophisticated and most modern trawlers available. And so this modernization in combination with the difficult food and supply situation in the nation is causing an immediately intense fisheries, an overly intense fisheries in comparison to what was going on before. You might say the fish got some years of, let's say, yeah, calm fishing or little fishing. Well, then in 1918, 1919, there was immediately a very modern, highly sophisticated fleet that was going all in on the fish stocks.
Now, a what if you don't mind? So, had the naval war in the North Sea perhaps been less static or more direct and constant, fleet versus fleet, do you think the impact would have been different long term?
Of course, what if is always something a historian shouldn't answer, but
Right, right.
It's fun to think about these stories. So therefore, this is if I'm thinking about more direct action between the big fleets, the capital warships, then I think there might have been a chance that the navies on both sides would have decided not to build so many of these small auxiliary warships. Basically, with the big warships, with the capital warships all in port, they relied on these auxiliary warships, minesweepers, VP boats, and whatsoever for the actual operations going on. So these small craft became kind of the most important part of naval operations in the North Sea theater. If thinking about big ship action going on, then that would have been the focus of the high command, that would have been the focus of investments. And so, therefore, I think the number of boats being available at the end of the war for being converted into trawlers would have been lower if big ship action would have continued. So that is, and then, of course, with the number of trawlers converted, then the effect on the fish stocks might have been lower. So if entering into this fleet versus fleet scenario, I think the paradoxical effect on the fish stocks of immediate overfishing after the end of the war might have been a little reduced in comparison as there would have been not such a big fleet of auxiliary warships that could be converted into trawlers.
Does World War II have a similar environmental impact on the North Sea?
When it comes to World War II, the situation is completely different, in particular as the fisheries is completely different. And when it comes to the fisheries prior to World War II were no longer really focusing on the North Sea, but has moved on to fishing grounds of northern Norway, fishing grounds of Iceland. Fisheries, continental European and British fisheries had moved out to the Atlantic. And so, therefore, the main effect, if talking about industrialized fisheries, then or distant water fisheries, we would need to talk about the North Atlantic theater and not about the North Sea theater. In the North Sea itself, of course, there was fishing continuing during World War II. And as it was now mainly local fisheries, coastal fisheries, this type of fishery was less affected by the war itself. So in the end, while World War One caused this more or less complete stop of fishing in the North Sea, World War Two saw a continuation of fishing in the North Sea, and because of a very different type of fisheries going on, and therefore, I think you can't really say that World War Two had a comparable effect. If we talk about the same story of Iceland, for example, then if we are talking about what was going on the Icelandic fishing grounds, we are seeing a comparable effect, a little smaller as there was, for example, some British fisheries continued, but German fisheries did not continue during World War II of Iceland. And so we are seeing the same reductions, the same basically positive effect on the stocks. But now we are talking about the North Atlantic and no longer the North Sea itself.
Any final thoughts?
Final thoughts when it comes to this one, of course, it's always if you're thinking about a war and the environment, and it's always, crazy to realize that war might have sometimes even paradoxical positive effects on the environment. And but on the other hand, what is it you are really seeing that pretty sure we like it or hate it, but you can see that war is the main driver for technological innovation. And if you're looking at the trawlers in 1918, trawlers in 1918 have basically been the same size as trawlers in 1919 or 20. But if you're looking at technology, horsepowers installed probably tripled. if you are thinking about seaworthiness, no longer an open bridge, but an enclosed wheelhouse with whatsoever kind of amenities. So, and seaworthiness increased by factors 2 or 3, I think. And so we are seeing that war is probably the main driver for innovation in trawling technology at that time. And of course, while short term, the war might have had positive effects on the stocks, long term, this technology developed for war purposes is then used, not saying in a war against environment, but in an increased utilization of the environment.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Heidbrink, for taking the time to share some of your research with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov.